Thank you. Well, thank you, Cammy, for inviting me here. I am a historian of art and science. I'm particularly interested in what we now call the intersections of art and science in the early modern period, specifically the 18th century. And I say we now call because in the 18th century it's often not very clear what's art and what's science. It's very much a continuum. And one of my main research interests is the production of knowledge through embodied practice, and also how people exchange embodied practice and produce it together. And I'm just showing you this one image today, which, because it's so huge, is now a little bit unsharp. But I wanted this one because it's part of a much larger project. Pascale just mentioned the Vesalius Atlas, which was published in the mid-16th century. This is actually a sketch for an atlas that was published almost 200 years later by or that's usually what is said. It was published by an anatomist, a Dutch anatomist, Bernard Siegfried Albinus, who was a professor of anatomy in Leiden. But it was actually very much a collaborative project because he made this together with Jan Wandelaar. And Jan Wandelaar was a draftsman. And they worked very intensively on this project together. In the end, they only published 2 parts. It was supposed to be 3, but then Wandelaar died, so the last part never materialized. And at Leiden University Library, they still have all the sketches for this atlas. It's a huge book, by the way. It's a folio, so it's almost half a meter high, which also immediately tells us that this was not a book that was meant for students. It was a very expensive book with large plates, and it was aimed at professionals. It was both a mnemonic for professionals who had done their own dissections already, and a prestigious object, because there's, for example, also a painting of a surgeon's guild sitting around a table with these books on it. So that shows us that these were not meant to be handled by students. They were way too expensive for that. And I think another reason was it wasn't made explicit by Albinus, but by one of his contemporaries, Caspar Wistar, who published a handbook for students in the late 18th century. And he says, well, actually, I haven't put any images in this book because I think it prevents students from making their own observations. If they look at the images, they then cannot observe properly what's right in front of them anymore. So that also, I think, plays an important role in Albinus' decision to make an atlas for his colleagues, for his peers, rather than for his students. So why this one image? Because it's a beautiful atlas with, big plates of the entire skeleton and also all kinds of plates of individual bones. And I picked this one slightly strange sketch of a part of the skull. So it's from beneath, actually, a cross-section. But I picked this because there's notes on it. And that's what makes it so interesting. It's barely legible, but it says there on the left-hand side, shouldn't these, it's in Dutch, but it says, shouldn't these also be on the other side? And it points to the little flecks on the drawing. And then in pen, it says yes. So that has been written by the guy who actually traced the outlines of what he wanted in his atlas. So the sketch is Wandelaar's, and the yes and the ink lines are Albinus' work. So there you see that this really was a very intense collaboration, something they really couldn't do without the other person. Wandelaar couldn't have done this without Albinus' anatomical knowledge and his practice, and Albinus couldn't have done this without Wandelaar and his skills. And because they lived so close together, we don't have any correspondence between the two of them. So it's things like these that we need to figure out how they work together. And I think, therefore, this image is a really interesting way into learning more about that. It's also a way to understand the way these 18th century professionals actually collaborated in creating what they felt was a perfect representation of human anatomy. And this, I must say, is also very much tied to religious convictions, because Albinus was very clear that he wanted to represent nature's perfection. And he did so through choosing skeletons that he thought were perfect. So he also used multiple skeletons for this atlas. It was not one body, which also obviously was necessary because it took such a long time to create it. The two of them had this very distinct idea about, for example, things should be symmetrical. And this is completely opposed to some of their contemporaries, like Govert Bitlow, who also made an anatomical atlas, but he actually shows decaying bodies because he came from a different religious, from a different church where actually hell and repentance were much more important than for Albinus, who was a sort of a regular Protestant. I think what's also interesting about this image is that it kind of hints at, but it also obscures the practices behind this. Because we know from Albinus's texts that he had a lot of trouble preserving the skeletons and the bones for this atlas. Of course, Wandelaar needed quite some time to draw them properly, and he describes very messy practices where he has to wet the ligaments of a skeleton with vinegar throughout a couple of months to make sure that it doesn't go all stinky and it doesn't rot. And he also complains, for example, that at some point Wandelaar wanted a very skinny man standing next to the skeleton, so he could compare the life form to the skeleton. And then the skinny man, it was winter, and he's like, well, I want a fire on, because otherwise I'm just going to freeze. And Albinus is like, well, that's not practical, because then my skeleton is going to rot. So it's very interesting how a sort of sanitized drawing like this obscures that messy embodied practice and all the very practical things you have to go through as an anatomist to actually create something like this. Right, so then that's what I kind of wanted to explain about anatomical drawing, that it's a collaboration. It sanitizes the embodied practices lying behind it. It's always a way of selecting what you show and what you don't show, and that in turn explains why books like these were aimed at professionals and not at students. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Those were really great presentations, and I just had a few questions. One thing that I was thinking about in medical textbooks and medical illustrations, and also because you invoked Vesalius, is the distinction between observational drawing and diagramming for these purposes. And on the one hand, diagramming maybe is an even more extreme form of this kind of sanitizing, but it's also an extreme form of selection. And maybe I'd begin with you, Pascale, because you were saying, like, well, you need to know, the medical illustrator needs to look, but she also needs to know. And I would think of diagramming as kind of like knowing, but also to a level of abstraction, so that, I mean, even in Leonardo's drawings, like I showed, he's deciding, okay, now I'm showing the circulatory system, now I'm, in a sense, that's almost like a diagram, now I'm showing something else. So I don't know, how do you, is that a question that speaks to you at all? How would you think of that distinction between observing and diagramming or abstracting? Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very important to do a lot of research. For every medical illustration that I make for a publication, I literally spend about a day researching and really familiarizing myself with that structure or the concept that they are trying to visualize and put on paper. So it is very, very important to conceptualize a drawing, and often the organic, beautiful art part of the illustration can be a deterrent what one is trying to explain. So it can be a bit too much and too frilly to show the whole organ as a realistic representation. So it's very often necessary to reduce drawing to a diagram, and in that way be very clear about what your intention is you're trying to explain, and also who the public is. That's a very important part. But as I mentioned before, making these medical illustrations for a fine artist, it's always been a bit of a battle within myself. Is and can medical illustration, which is a functional art form, can that be also a fine art form? So purely for its aesthetic. And I find with me, it always creeps in. However much I try not to put the emotion in there, I see it does creep in. So can't help it.
And this is a slightly different question, Anne, but I'm very fascinated by the training that you described, because I've actually never heard of that in other cultural contexts, and I don't know if I just haven't been talking to enough doctors who are educated in it, but about how you were trained in terms of drawing as part of the learning process. And I'm curious if that, what were you asked to do? Were you asked to, I guess it relates to the diagramming potentially as well. Were you asked to just draw what you saw, or was the idea, here's, we want you to understand this system or this connection, these ligaments better, do a diagram based on this skeleton of how those things relate. What was the charge in a sense, or the assignment?
So it was very free, actually. We were given the library, so you were responsible for looking up, and I think that's important, what you need to know before. You need to know some knowledge before you can see something. And then the day where the specimens were there, human, animal, plants, you had to do some... The specimens were there, and then at the end of the day, you have to talk what you have seen and what you have learned. So it was completely your own work. So, and that was the pleasant thing, because nobody told you should see that. No, you had to discover for yourself, and that is very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then what happened afterward? Would the professor or teacher then critique you and say, "Oh, you missed this," or and it was more like in that sense. I mean, they wouldn't say, "Oh, lovely use of charcoal."
No. It was really it didn't have to be beautiful. No, definitely not. Yeah. But it needs to be right, and says what was there. Yeah, that was the main purpose. And you can only do that if you understand it. But that's with everything. Like if you read an article or you write an article, if you cannot tell it in an easy way, you don't understand it. Right. So it's not worth reading. So it's really important that you know the essence, or you try to know, because sometimes it's not known. And like for anatomy, a lot of things is known, but for new things in scientific worlds, there's a new invention, and you don't know exactly what it is. But to go further, another group of research, you need to know a little bit about it to go further.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so there was also some kind of process of simplification, or And do you even know, did it suddenly stop, this practice of having?
I think in many educational programs, the courses are much more rigid, in my opinion, and the importance of to discover it yourself is come a bit later, maybe. I'm not sure, but
although anecdotally, I don't know if this is true in the Netherlands or in Belgium at all, but in the U.S., in some medical schools, like I know Yale does this, and several others have introduced art history courses for medical students, and the idea is basically not through drawing. I would love it if they did that, but through art history and going to museums to kind of at least encourage the students to learn to slow observation and looking. Because
that's happening in the Netherlands as well, but it's very much focused on looking.
Right.
So you go to a museum and you all look at a painting, and you really have to dive into the details. But as far as I'm aware, drawing is not a huge part of it. So that's maybe something that
looking as well, I think, is important. I remember having a conversation with a radiologist, and he was talking about we have all these instruments, but we assume that it's obvious then how to read, a radiology report or a scan or any of these things. But it's visual information, and it's still an act of interpretation to read it. So he in fact made his students take art history courses and so forth. It's not the same, but it's taking art history or learning to draw, but it's certainly related. Yeah. In regard to what you were presenting, I was curious. You mentioned this issue of audience and who are the drawings for and so forth. So you mentioned that they're large, but they're not for students. You're thinking they're not for students because they're luxury.
Yes.
But so for patrons tell us more about what's the function.
Peers. If you look at the people who signed up for the book, because books like these were often published by lists of people who said they would buy it once it was published, or even sort of crowdfunding, so they had to help in the financing of the printing. And if you look at those lists, these are all guilds, doctors. Sometimes it's just upper class people who want an interesting item for their library, but it's very much aimed at those groups and not at students. If you look at because we have quite a few volumes of student notes of Albinus's classes, they never mentioned this book. It wasn't.
So you don't think they could even see these?
No, I don't think this, because this was so expensive. This wouldn't be something that was freely accessible in the university library. You would really have to get permission to view it. And in the notes, you do see that preparations were used in class very much, and Albinus also was famous for his preparations. But those were his own collection, and he took them to class, and they were also used in a much more interactive way than we assumed for a long time. They were taken out of the jars and, even redissected sometimes. And these drawings really are, in that sense, a different category. They're really aimed at people who already have done their own observations and who need a reminder of, what's where.
Right.
And it was also very much a way for an anatomist such as Albinus to position himself as an authority, an accomplished, elegant anatomist.
Yes, it served as a kind of reference to. Exactly. That's quite interesting. I want to open it up for questions. Yes, please, Rahel.
So I wanted to ask a question regarding the body as a moving object. The relation we had it before with time and the body being like something that stuff moves around, that it moves itself. How much is that also asked for to kind of show these processes in a drawing? Of course, there's animation, there's computer animation, which this makes it much more easier, but still, I think through drawing and make it abstract, these processes, it could be really interesting. And is that asked for or not? And maybe also does this cross the bridge between just draw what you see and also kind of go more into the field of fine arts, kind of more abstract, more like conceptual drawing?
I can maybe answer that. A while ago, I was asked to make a whole book of illustrations for the anatomy of stretching, and that was incredible learning curve, because most of the reference material one has is a body in the anatomical position, either like that, or from the back, or from the side. At that time, this was quite a few years ago, there wasn't really much reference material for moving muscles and the moving body, and what the muscles do when you move the body, especially in the arms, was so difficult, because we had to illustrate the deeper layers of the muscles in the arm and in the leg. And so it was for sports, for particular sports like swimming or ball sports, the stretching people use for the particular sport. So it was sort of split up in those categories. It's really difficult because there's not enough of reference material. But in the biomab sessions, drawing sessions, the interesting part is that the specimens are not fixed and they're fresh frozen. So when Francis is dissecting the arm or the leg, he can actually still pull the muscles, and the body will move. And you can turn the arm around, and he sometimes just shows it as a demonstration, where he pulls one tendon, and it shows you what the action of that muscle is, and the arm flips around. It's amazing, and the same thing with the foot. So in that sense, it's also quite unique to see the body as it would in real life, because everything's still flexible and mechanical. So yeah, the function of anatomy, this is probably what's changed with past drawings of anatomy, is that we need to know now what the body does, and so to speak, if you take its skin off, what those muscles look like when it's moving.
But it's still interesting just drawing. I think it's a great question, because it's still, the examples you showed are still drawing from specimens, right? You know, I took this out of the jar, or I was looking at it out in the jar, I took the brain out of the jar, or whatever. And I guess thinking of it from a 16th century point of view, one of the things that's interesting about Michelangelo or Leonardo is they're doing these dissections and from the dead bodies, but then they're also extremely interested in movement of people, of living people, or a rearing horse and so forth. And that's, especially kind of pre-photography, that's extremely challenging and interesting to capture. I wondered, was part of your training also kind of people in motion, or it was always with
life drawing, you mean?
Yeah.
I had an awful lot of life drawing.
Yeah.
And it was also one of the exercises was 5-minute or 10-minute drawings when the body
drawings.
slowly moves around.
Right.
So you had to really capture that.
Right.
Yeah, that definitely helped for sure. But you still know what the muscles do underneath, and how they move in relation with each other.
You don't have X-ray vision.
No.
We haven't developed that yet.
But with modern imaging techniques, obviously, it's become a lot easier to do the referencing and to make sure it's correct.
Absolutely.
And there's also, there's still, just to add, there is still more abstract moving processes in the body, right? Like that you can't see by eye.
Definitely.
You can kind of put
beating
it
heart
on paper or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
To make it visible.
Definitely, like the workings of a kidney, how does it filter the blood? And it's wonderful, because when you then know the functionality of these cells, like the nephrons, and it's obvious why they are the shape they are, because of its functionality. That's what they're doing. So they are shaped with all these little fingers that hook into each other to stop the blood cells from coming through, but only the plasma. And it's wonderful. I'm just so in awe of the human body. It's designed to such perfection. It's divine.
Ryan,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just something that came to me that speaks to this topic in general. More and more peer-reviewed journals in the sciences are requiring that when you publish your paper with them after peer review, you provide a table of contents art. And basically it's supposed to gain interest to get people to read your article, have some sort of visual, sort of enticing summary of the work. But what journals consider this TOC art to be and not to be is kind of interesting. A chemistry colleague of mine has several times, she's also an amateur artist, come up with a really creative drawing that summarizes the chemistry she's presenting, and then the journals are like, no, like that's not serious enough or technical enough. But they're very happy if you just like take a figure that's already in the paper and like, simplify it or something like that. I don't know if like this is happening in any of your fields or if you've observed this. It may also be an opportunity where there's a new opportunity for people who do observational drawings or artwork at the intersection with science to contribute, because often, like, I honestly don't like dealing with these journals that mandate this TOC art, because it's like, I don't even think about it. We get the paper through peer review, and then they're like, where's your TOC art? And I'm like, oh yeah, right. Like, what are we going to do?
Right, it's an afterthought. Yeah. So. As opposed to, no, it's very nice to think of it as a potential for collaboration. Right. But if it's left to the, left to the end, that's a little difficult. I don't know if any...
Yeah, this is pretty much happening in the medical illustration world, but I'm just not an advocate of it, because people use other people's drawings or known drawings and then flip them and adapt them a bit and then change them into... But you also take over the inaccuracies and the mistakes, and then it's sort of copied, and this is really not what medical illustration should be about. It's very much about going to the source and looking with your own eyes, as Vesalius did in his time, and then for yourself you're accurate. And
but it seems like, I think, it is an opportunity in a sense. If you want to take it seriously, then you kind of like begin a collaboration earlier on, and then it makes sense. Otherwise, it seems, a little superficial.
Or even it could end up essentially cheapening the contributions of the artist, because I'm a scientist. I'm not trained in art, but here I am being asked to provide art that summarizes my work.
No, that's absolutely right. Jessie, did you have your hand up? Oh, Kara. Okay, Kara, please.
Thank you, all of you. This is really quite interesting. So I, as a personal background, I was really struck, this is really for you, Dr. van der Velde. My father-in-law is trained as a neurologist and now practices as a psychoanalyst. So I am interested in the comment from a personal standpoint that you made about this comparison between the experience of training in previous years, where there was more focus on anatomy, and the shift specifically that you identified in medical training towards these more communicative, let's say interpersonal related ways of speaking with patients, right? This reflects a shift in the discipline writ large towards more interpersonal reactions with the patient, as opposed to perhaps exclusively observational bodily behavior. Yes, to simplify. And I wondered, perhaps this is a question for you or for anyone, how we might speculate on what sort of observational tools are used. What's the corollary to drawing in this second phase that you're describing?
That's interesting.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I think I cannot give the right answer, but it's worthwhile thinking about it and reflecting on it. I think mention it here is very important, and it's not exactly an answer to your questions, but the collaboration very early between the scientists, I think, it's a word, but somebody who has an idea and wants to research something, and then the artist who also has an idea and wants to research the same thing. And if there is a collaboration between and a respect between the two, that's very important. And the respect, everything comes with respect, and like in the past, but also now, even on the slide, you see albinus, but you don't see the name of Wassenaar. So it's always, in old publications, in new publications, the first author is the scientist, and there is a link or a gratitude to the artist and that should change, I think, also for the general public to see that both worlds are the same, actually.
I was just thinking.
So I think it's a bit answered, not quietly, but it's very interesting, the question.
The collaboration makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I was thinking, just from a friend who was an English major and then became a doctor, what she talked about was listening, like training to listen, and that in itself was not a given, and it was also kind of slow. And to me, listening and drawing are in some ways parallel in a training of a certain kind of attention and attentiveness and so forth.
I also thought that dance example that you gave was quite striking. And then this comes for me into the question of what kinds of art forms we give priority to, which are serious, right? So and how does medical illustration, for example, convey seriousness, and which ties back to this point about the table of contents. Well, it has to be visually interesting. We have to attract the reader, but it also has to convey seriousness. So the drawing you make yourself as the scientist, that's not serious. So, by first principle, a priori, we can't accept it, right? And I wonder too, because the dance images that you showed, I think, at least from a personal perspective, anyone who's spent more than a night in the hospital knows the experience of sort of bodily alienation that was represented, right? And one speculates about, well, could we make that, how does that become, is it serious enough to function in medical training, for example?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Because that's a very interesting observation indeed, and something Anna Harris's group in Maastricht is also exploring through ethnographies of care. And it also reminds me what you just said, what's taken serious and what isn't, but Anita Gorini's work on how early modern kitchen tools and surgical tools are very, very similar, and how a lot of early modern anatomical handbooks actually refer to skills in the kitchen. It literally says sometimes, like every common cook knows, and then something, But for a long time, that was kind of swept under the carpet by the history of medicine, because it wasn't supposed to be taken serious.
It didn't seem
right?
serious. It seemed probably female, and
yeah, exactly. Feminized space.
These are fantastic topics. I think I propose we continue them over lunch. Everyone's invited downstairs. And please join me in thanking all of our terrific panelists today. Thank you so much.